What does it mean to have no address? No address equals unemployment, no housing, no education, no place to call home, criminalization of innocent people, not a part of society. Though having an address equals solutions. This is the No Address Podcast. Welcome to episode 11 of No Address Podcast, where we break down the philosophy of having no address and what that really means. Thank you for tuning in today. Please go ahead and subscribe and visit our website, noaddressdocumentary.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Also, we have a lot of updates and a lot of good things that are coming, so stay tuned, subscribe to the newsletter, and you can also donate on our page as well, because we want to keep continuing to put the content out there, bringing awareness and creating real change. The ultimate goal, creating real change and affordable alternative housing. So visit noaddressdocumentary.com. And I thank you for your support in advance. Alrighty, so on today's show, I have Kamau Franklin of Community Movement Builders in Atlanta, Georgia. I saw this brother on Tamara Shealy's show called Tamara Shealy for Senate. By the way, you ran an awesome campaign, Tamara. And so he was talking about gentrification, police brutality, how everything's all interconnected, and building our communities up and having the resources to do it and the mindset. So I was like, you know what? I definitely want this brother on my show, because the interconnectivity is where gentrification meets homelessness. And that's going to be our topic for today. So I definitely wanted to bring him on the show so we can delve into this further and really have a conversation about what's going on in America, and specifically Atlanta, Georgia, where we're located. Thank you for being on the show today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Hope I can live up to the expectations.
Oh, I'm sure you will. So tell me who you are.
Well, my name is Kamau Franklin. I'm the director of Community Movement Builders, which is a grassroots organization. I'm a father, a husband. I used to be a practicing attorney, but for the most part, I've been an organizer for about 30 some odd years, and organizing around issues of, in general, what I would say is like sort of Black liberation movement issues. So I feel like, in terms of who we are in America, that we as a people will never be free or liberated until we start to think about how we can control institutions, organizations, and get other organizations and institutions and the state off our back. So for me, my life, in terms of my life's work, has been dedicated to that as an idea, as something that we need to accomplish. And as far as sort of a personal career, I've probably given a lot of that up to my wife's chagrin. She's not always pleased by that. But I haven't done as much as I could because I've been so focused on what I can do as an organizer and activist. And so that kind of sums me up, I think, in its briefest way,
What sparked that?
Well, my mom is from Charleston, South Carolina, and she grew up doing Jim Crow. So she would tell me and my sisters stories when she was younger about what life was like under Jim Crow. In fact, she has a story where she tells us about how she and her friends were in a whites-only playground, and a cop was chasing them off, and she was a little slow, so she got hit in her back by a billy club. And she has a scar to this day. My mom is 79 years old. She has a scar to this day of that incident. And so her telling us these stories about living under Jim Crow, but yet still, my mom, who's a dark-skinned Black woman, I think like a lot of folks, not only in the South, but in the North, we still have this connection to whiteness as we see it as something greater than, something to aspire to. And my mom, even in terms of her life choices, when she decided to have children, she purposefully lightened up her kids, thinking that that would provide them an easier road in America. So it's not to say that she didn't love the people that she was with, but that was a conscious choice. And when you hear that, it's kind of like, wow, the fact that folks feel or think that in order for them to have a better life chances, they have to produce offspring, which look somewhat different from them or who they are or that kind of thing. And for her not to necessarily be wrong, right? That's not even a wrong thought, but the fact that you think that you might have to act on it or that it's somehow that you think something else like that is more beautiful. So my sister's brown skin, I'm light skinned, my father was white. We didn't grow up with our fathers, we grew up with our mom, but we also grew up, in Brooklyn, born and raised in Brooklyn. And we grew up, in not necessarily like in the streets, but in the hood, right? So, we grew up in two places I was raised, 619 Nostrand Avenue in Crown Heights and 205 Albany Avenue in the projects in Crown Heights. So even that, like hearing my mom's stories and then just experiencing life in the projects and just seeing how we as a people survive, that also just got me thinking about who are we? Why are we here? What's the role of the larger society in putting us in these places? And that got me reading about Malcolm and reading Malcolm X and all that kind of stuff. And that just opened up a new world in terms of reading Malcolm and Chomsky and all about like sort of liberation struggles, the freedom struggles within the United States. And again, that sort of set me on a path to being an organizer for the rest of my life.
Wow, that's amazing. And look, hence, we are here, community movement builders. So, how long have you been in existence and what do you all provide?
CMB has been in existence now for about 5 years. Started as part of a job I had. It was kind of a youth program. Someone offered a donation to buy a house because they wanted to help do things to get us off the grid. And my idea was like, well, I'm a community organizer. And they contacted me individually to do it. And then I said, okay, let's do it. And I tried to involve young people from my job and they were excited about it. But my bosses weren't excited about it. And so they gave me an ultimatum. They said I couldn't do it. And once they told me I can't do it, then of course I decided to do it. And then they decided I couldn't work there no more. So that was my retirement job though. So my wife again is not too pleased about that decision. But that led to me doing the organizing here under CMB. And right now we have 6 chapters here in Atlanta. We have a chapter in New Orleans and Memphis and San Diego, in Detroit and in Dallas. So we have those chapters. And basically our work, I would say, is two-pronged. It is community organizing work. So we do organizing around the issue of gentrification here in Atlanta, particularly we're in Southwest Atlanta, in the Pittsburgh area of Atlanta, which was started as a community in 1886 by formerly enslaved Africans. And we also do organizing work against police brutality. There was a recent murder in Atlanta, this brother named Rashad Brooks, who was killed by police at a nearby Wendy's. And so we started to do more police misconduct work, and so we've been diving heavy into that. Then we also do what we call sustainable development, which is trying to create cooperatives and small business models that can be owned by folks in the community, by some of the young folks that we work with. So currently we have an aquaponics cooperative, a sea moss cooperative, a kale chip cooperative is on the way, and a security cooperative. And I should say within that security cooperative, we've also started doing cop watch patrols and safety patrols where we walk out in the community, a la the Panthers, but not with open carry, and watch what's happening in terms of any police interaction with folks in our community, and also try to de-escalate any harm that might be happening between folks in the community. We also do what we call sustainable development, as in we provide funding for folks to stay in their homes. If they're late on rent or their mortgage payments or utility bills, you provide some funding for that. And lastly, we do what we call mutual aid work during this COVID crisis, where we provide food and toiletries to folks who are in need of in terms of trying to do social distancing. So in a nutshell, that's what we do. We're basically a volunteer-based organization, though. People join us on their ideology. As with all organizations, we're trying to raise resources and so forth. But we situate ourselves within the Black liberation struggle. So our ideology is around working as a Black organization, trying to find ways to create organization and fighting for self-determination for our larger community.
You all do a lot.
We try to do a lot with a little, yeah.
And you're making it happen. It really doesn't take much. You just need the right team, the right resources. I say do what you love and the universe will provide.
I hope you're so right, sister. I hope you're right, yeah. And so far, I think, you know what? In some ways, I think you are correct. Like we've gotten folks who have joined our organization. We've gotten a little bit of funding here and there from different folks. So I do think we're building something. We've got 6 chapters now. So I think we're building something. We do work in Haiti. I didn't mention that, where we're working with a socialist organization to do something similar and create sort of a sustainable space they're going to build themselves a community house, which is similar to the community house we're doing the filming in. So we're working internationally as well as locally. So yeah, I agree with you. Like you follow your passion, you do what you believe in, and if you do it wisely, you fall on your face, you get back up, and you keep trying. Hopefully, things will start to come together. And I feel little by little things are coming together. So I agree with you. Yes.
Awesome, awesome. So tell me about some of the impacts you all have made with what you've done.
I think some of the biggest impact is that we have gotten to know the community and started to help politicize the community around the issue of gentrification. And so when we first came to the neighborhood, it was because also two young people from the program that I worked with, they found this house in Pittsburgh because one of them was a former resident of Pittsburgh. They found the house. It was next to a community garden, and the community garden was overgrown with bushes and so forth. And so again, for the price, we said, hey, we can do this. And we established ourselves here. We work with residents of the community. We are part of other local grassroots organizations that are here. We do work with the neighborhood association. And so building a sense of consciousness around, hey, this is our community, not just because we happen to live here, but because folks have put in time, energy, resources, and we need to make sure that we can do everything that we can to hold on to it before the plight of gentrification comes and takes this whole thing away from us. And so I think we have helped sort of put that consciousness and also do a little scare tactics with politicians and elected officials around the fact that, look, we see what's happening. We understand that this is a historic trend within Atlanta, and we can't be nice about it anymore. We have to do everything that we can to make sure that folks have their voices heard, that we're speaking loud about this issue, that there's an impact around the work that we're doing. So we've done a petition drive, yard signs. There's a beautiful mural outside on the side of this particular house. We're doing organizing in terms of demonstrations against city council folks. And so we're doing all that we can to say, look at this issue. We're joining with other organizations that are doing legislative action around it. So we're trying to do everything that we can, particularly being sort of the loud street arm around the issue of gentrification, to say to folks, we need to fight back. Because otherwise, in 4 or 5 years, we're not going to be here anymore. We're going to be further pushed outside of Atlanta, and we just can't let that happen without a fight at least.
I know, it's like, what are they trying to make Atlanta? Hashtag so white?
That's exactly what they're trying to do, right? I mean, we have a history here of black mayors for the last 40 or 50 years. And during that time period, the population of Atlanta is going from over 60% black to barely 50% black, right? So just think about that. Folks have been moved out. We have the historic things that happened around the Olympics where public housing was destroyed, where folks were paid to move out of Atlanta and not to come back. So the trend here in Atlanta around these black elected officials who have thrown in with the white economic elite to say, like, you know what, we want Atlanta the way we like to see it, which is gentrified, which is corporate dominated, which is around bringing back some middle class white folks, bringing up property values and prices, being a place where the real estate developers are king. That's what they wanted. And again, these black elected officials who depend on black votes have brought into that hook, line, and sinker, and have now been a part of gentrification again for the last 40 years. It's not an accident. It's not something that snuck up on them. All that's been created around Atlanta in the last 40 years has been done with the consent and agreement with black elected officials. The Beltline has been something that's been a complete gentrification project here in Atlanta. So all these things have been known and they've been allowed to happen because this is what the white economic elite has wanted, and the black political elite has decided to join with them to make these things take place.
Wow, it's totally systematic. It's like, let's infiltrate all the states, all the cities, and now Atlanta, it's your turn. So what have you seen progressing through gentrification in this neighborhood?
I mean, in this neighborhood, we've seen, it's still a majority black neighborhood, but we've definitely seen more white neighbors. We've definitely seen that the housing construction has changed completely. Again, when we bought this house about 4 or 5 years ago, we bought it for $60,000. The last time I checked the value of this house, it's close to $200,000. And trust me, we've not done that much in terms of working on this house to make its value such. And all the other houses in the neighborhood are starting to be just like that. You see more development, and the development is for higher end housing, which brings up the tax values of the houses, which means even if you've paid off your mortgage and it's 30 years later and you think you're securing your home, now the taxes are going up and now you have to worry about paying off those taxes. And now that you don't have a mortgage anymore, your taxes aren't spread out over once a year. Now you get one big tax bill. And if you can't afford to pay that, the county, Fulton County, is happy to take your house from you and to sell it in an auction to the highest bidder or to a moderate bidder who's part of a development class, again, that's going to flip that house and make it far more expensive. So we've seen that happening over and over and over again in this neighborhood, to the point where folks are mad and they are trying to fight back. The rents have gone up exponentially in this neighborhood, where folks are being forced to move out because they can no longer afford something that used to be a 2 or 3 bedroom for $700 or $800 is now in the $1,300 to $1,500 to $1,600 price range. So with this neighborhood, Southwest Atlanta, is one of the last areas that is majority black and is now targeted by real estate developers to be the next place that's gentrified, that brings in more white residents, that brings in higher income folks. And there's that class divide, even with folks in the community who think that if they get to sell their home for a higher price, that they somehow made it now. But unfortunately, even when they get to sell their homes, they can't afford to continue to live in Atlanta. It's not like they get to live further in town. They have to move out of town, right? And so that means public transportation is less. That means it's a longer drive, so that's more money for gas. There's less social services. Jobs are not as plentiful. So there's a lot of disadvantages that come with selling your home when you're living in Atlanta and being forced to move outside of it. So those are the kind of changes that have been on the table for the last 3 or 4 years. I think the COVID crisis in some ways have potentially slowed it down, but I can't be sure about that because the prices in Atlanta have not suffered at all. The question becomes whether or not folks will still move in town at the fast rate that they have been in the past, or whether or not because of this COVID, they're going to be a little scared to continue to move in a denser populated area. But for right now, gentrification is still on and popping. And this community right here is one of the #1 targets of developers, real estate developers coming in and saying, we can change this neighborhood over and bring in higher prices for folks who have more money.
Okay, all of this is going on. People are selling their house, getting whatever pennies on the dollar for their house. And where are the people going? And do they even care where they're going? Are they saying like we have alternative means of affordable housing?
No, I think the city is giving lip service to that. I mean, when you look at the housing, the destruction of public housing, the city did not build one-for-one housing in replacement for those public housing units that went down. Instead, you could say it was like 1 out of every 5 to 8 people, if they were lucky, got to stay in some mixed-use housing or sort of some new housing. But basically, people were left on their own. They had to fend for themselves. They had to go sleep on couches. They had to find new places outside of the city to live. And that, again, this has been the trend, is that the city makes all these promises around what they're going to do to sort of build up new places and new housing. And the mixed income usage is a scam, right? Because they'll put aside 10%, 15% of apartments for supposedly low-income folks. But what then they actually do is that those places are time limited. So like after 10 years, they can become market rate. And then if for whatever reason those folks are evicted or leave the premises, then those apartments now become market rate also. And so that gives the landlord an incentive for trying to figure out how to get these folks out of here, right? And then that whole idea that, if you're poor and you live next to somebody middle class, it's going to be great for you because supposedly you're going to see how they live and you're going to change your behavior. I mean, it's absolute nonsense because first, your social circles have been lost. So those friends, right, that you've depended upon, and with all the problems that folks have in poor working class communities, there's still a social fabric that's been developed, right? You have people who can watch your car, people who can watch your kids, people who sometimes you can get a meal from, you can have dinner with, your friendships you hang out with, people you can borrow money from every now and then. I mean, those are social networks that people have had. Those things are destroyed for the idea that somehow you're going to live next to some middle class person who's going to actually look down on you, right? Because you're not wearing what they're wearing, you don't look like what they look like, that kind of thing. And they're actually hoping to get you out of the neighborhood, right? We need things in our neighborhood, but the problem is that we don't get to dictate what comes into our communities and our neighborhoods. And so when we're like sort of stranded on some island with other folks who don't necessarily want to be a part of you or have a part of you, after a while, I've heard stories of folks who are like, it just wasn't a good fit, right? It didn't make them feel comfortable or at home. And again, even with some place that's under-resourced, there was a sense of some camaraderie and so forth, right? And it's, again, this is not to idealize what poor folks go through in terms of where we live and what we've had to go through. But it is to say that there is something of a social fabric that gets ripped apart. And no one thinks about that, because what they're thinking about, particularly, again, the real estate developers, the politicians, they're thinking about the money, they're thinking about the profit. The politicians are thinking about something shiny and new that they can take some credit for, saying that they built. And all they want to do is to see the poor folks go away, right? And you've seen that time and time again. We talked a little bit before about how Atlanta seems to be headed towards trying to be a city like San Francisco or Seattle, right? Someplace where poor folks or working class folks are just not welcomed, right? Where the average median income is somewhere in the six figures, and for a six-figure income, you probably can only afford a space of 1,400 square feet. Right? So we're looking at the inequity that's taking such a strong hold here in what folks like to pretend is the Black Mecca. It's not the Black Mecca for everybody, right? Working class folks struggle in Atlanta. The social mobility numbers are the worst in the nation for Black folks. The income disparity between white folks and Black folks is one of the worst in the nation. All done under the regimes of Black mayors and Black city councils who make promises after promises after promises to their constituents, and they don't fulfill them, but they come back every 2 years or every 4 years asking for a vote, right? And I think that's the situation, particularly that poor and working class people, but poor and working class Black people in particular, live under in Atlanta.
So I want you to tell me about the West End and the new developments that are going on there. Listen up, this is crazy.
The gentrification in the West End, which is nearby Southwest Atlanta, has been going on for about 15 years, right? When I think back in about 2010, 2011, it was really, they really started to flip properties. Housing started to go up exponentially again. You saw a lot of white folks moving into this historic Black neighborhood. And then we had during that time period, a little bit during that time period, you had the Great Recession a little bit before that, but it started to slow down the bigger piece of gentrification in that area. So only now over the last 7 or 8 years has it began to start to come back. And it's been coming back now through the changing of some of the commercial properties. You have now the West End Mall, which is being demolished for this larger mall and hotel project, which is being built, which is a high-end project, right? And again, it's meant for people who have resources to spend the same way folks in Buckhead have resources. These folks are now going to be treated to a mall that's very similar to Buckhead, now in the West End, which can only have the same impact because it'll drive up the cost of commercial property. It'll drive up the monthly rents for people who have commercial property. It'll drive up the taxes for small business owners who have commercial property, which in exchange then start to drive up the personal property, the residential property that people have in terms of taxes and pricing. And so again, the threat is that the West End will be a model of gentrification, which will again only have a larger spillover to what's going to be left of Southwest Atlanta.
And now, the moratorium on evictions. Yes, that sounds great on paper, but you have to pay all that back. And some people realize it and some people don't. That's going to be lifted next month, December 31st. And if they don't do an extension, what's going to happen to America? What are your thoughts?
So I think with the COVID issue and housing, with the moratorium on rents or evictions, right, it's not a real structural change that's happening. And it's not, I'm not complaining about the fact that this stuff was put on pause. It should have been put on pause, right? We should make sure that people are not being evicted. But as we talked about a couple of seconds ago, it doesn't mean that you don't owe that back rent and you have to figure out how to pay that back rent, right? It doesn't mean that in some ways, if they can't get you on a direct non-payment, there are still openings to get you out on other lease issues, right? So it's not a complete moratorium on evictions, it's a moratorium on non-payment of rent as a moratorium. So if you're a industrious landlord, a slimy landlord, you're gonna start thinking about other ways you're gonna get folks out. And that's partly what's gonna happen.
Yes, even talk about when that happens, these scavengers, vultures will come in and take your place that fast, and they probably don't have to pay that back rent or mortgage.
If, for the landlord's point of view, if they get you out, and again, if they think they can raise the rent and get more money off of somebody moving outside of Atlanta, somebody who has more income, they're going to do that, right? Because that's how they think. They don't care about who's in their place. They care about getting steady rent, and then they care about getting increased in rent payments. That's how they survive, right? They're not looking about, and again, it's about this whole housing system that's not about a system of human rights or housing justice or making sure everyone has a dwelling over their head, right? It's not about basic human rights. It's about profit. And people are going to be driven, even nice people, they're going to be driven by a profit motive. If you don't pay that rent, I got to get you out. And sometimes it's legitimate, as in even that working class person who happens to own a second home, they have a mortgage, right? And so they need to get that mortgage. So there's all these things that work together that says housing is not about stability of people having a roof over their head. It's not about making sure that people have their basic needs and necessities met. It's about working within a market system that says if you have more money, you're a winner. And if you don't have more money, you're a loser, and we don't care what happens to you. So that's the basic system that we work under. And that system has not been changed, right? There's nothing about what's happening now under Trump or that could happen under Biden that's changing that. There's nothing that's happening at the state level, that's happening at the local level, that's going to be changing that. This is the system that we have until we, again, are able to chip away, to change, to make radical change that says housing is a human right, and that there has to be certain things that are put in place around income levels. In New York, there's rent caps and rent stabilization that says you can only raise a rent so much. And again, we can find alternative means to provide housing, i.e. land trusts, so that more people can have access to housing and they don't have to worry every month with the stress of being potentially thrown out of their homes.
So when they're thrown out of their homes, they'll go into the streets, hence no address. So there's going to be a huge influx of homelessness, and they're already projecting 50 million people. And then we get into the criminalization of homelessness. And think about the people that have this luxurious life or just a comfortable life, right?
Yeah.
And if you are falling victim to experience homelessness on the streets, sitting down may get you a citation. Panhandling will get you a citation. And not realizing that you may get arrested for that action.
To have panhandling be illegal in certain places, right? To have, like you said, taking up 2 spaces on a park bench be something that could be a fine. To have to pee and you only can pee outdoors, right? Those things are criminalizing folks who don't have any dwelling over their head whatsoever, are forced to survive in a society that doesn't provide your basic needs. And then and if you can't do that, the response of the city officials is to pour money into the policing system, to arrest you, to jail you, to have you be cheap labor within a prison system, as opposed to provide basic housing to people. That's the society that we live in, right? It's first think of the criminalization and the blaming of people for not being able to sustain themselves in this crooked society, as opposed to with all the resources that this society has, more than any other society in human resource, in human history in terms of having resources, and we can't figure out how to solve housing. We can't put our brilliant brains together to think about housing. We can think about how to get folks get more satellites in space, right? We can think about other things in terms of luxury condos, gold-plated sinks, and so forth. We can figure all of that stuff out, but we can't figure out a system of housing that makes sure that people's basic needs are met. That's something that's just pitiful, right? That's just something that's disgusting, and it's something that's based on an economic system, a class system that, again, doesn't care about you unless you are someone who's rich, or unless they can use your labor to get rich and or maintain their wealth, or maintain a system of inequity, of white supremacy, of capitalism, which keeps working class and poor folks downtrodden while others stay rich and happy in their dwellings, in their 5,000, 10,000 square foot dwellings, while people really have to live in a tent outside.
Then on top of that, all the city's going to look like Skid Row. Tents everywhere, people everywhere. What are your thoughts?
I mean, when you look at the housing crisis and how that creates homelessness, when you look at the last Great Recession, right, 10 years ago, you had hundreds of thousands of people who are now homeless again, right? During COVID, right? You have hundreds of thousands of people now who are going to be homeless, and during this recession, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, like you said, who are going to now be homeless. Then what that's going to look like is it's going to look like people in tent cities, people living under bridges, people getting arrested, having their tents torn down by city officials. City officials, again, pushing people outside the limits of these big cities, outside the boundaries of these big cities, trying to convince smaller cities to take these folks through buy-offs, through payoffs, trying to pay people again to leave cities, right? If I give you $500 and I'll give you a one-way bus ticket, that's what people think of policy, right? That's the best that we can do in terms of our human endeavors of coming up with a sound policy to help homeless people, is to give them a bus ticket, a one-way bus ticket out of town. And that's what you're going to see. You're going to see these cities competing on how to get rid of their homeless population. That's what you see. I don't see great ideas coming from this political system in different cities around how do you abate homelessness, right? I think there's a couple of small models out there that maybe that we may look at, but for the most part, cities have been using the same tactics that they've been using for the last 20 to 30 years, which is to get rid of their homeless, to get rid of their poor, to displace people, and to make it somebody else's problem, right? And all they're interested in is, again, shiny new buildings. They're interested in pleasant looking downtowns. They're interested in people who can eat at fancy restaurants, people who can buy meals that are like expensive, and live in homes and apartments that are expensive. And that's what they see as success, right? It's not how do we move people into, again, having basic needs met. And I think that's what we're going to continue to see. Folks being pushed out of cities, pushed out of large metropolises, but they're not thinking of like real solutions that are going to make these folks' lives better.
I feel like there's an underlying agenda, and it doesn't matter whose face or the poster child is for the country at that moment. There is a role to play, and they are going to do what they were hired to do.
Well, I think the purpose is twofold. The purpose is, one, as we stated, to get rid of your poor population, right? The purpose is not to care about your poor population, is to chase them out of city limits. Two, your purpose is to have cheap labor, disposable labor, that if you arrest somebody and you charge them and they get convicted and they have to go to prison for a year, then that's somebody who can work on a farm, work in a plantation, make cheap clothes, make other cheap items. That's part of it. It's like, what do we do with this labor? We make it work. There's also an extraction policy that even through your poor citizens, you extract fines, you extract fees, right? That's what the policy is how do we continue to chase these people, and how do we make these people not be a threat, right? So we keep their lives disorganized, we keep them displaced, we keep rousing them around so that they are not in any position whatsoever to organize themselves. Some of these folks, they've had such hard lives that they need social service help. They need mental health help. So it's what do we do to keep these folks scrambling? It's not what we do to help end this problem, because like you said, the insidiousness of it is that they're not trying to end the problem. They're trying to extract what they can from a poor population, and to keep that poor population disparaged and displaced, and keep them away from each other, so that there's no real organizing that can happen, because folks are not in a position, either mentally, socially, or whatever, to gather together to say that we can fight back. That's what the hope is, right? And the homeless just represent one level of that. But again, poor and working class people who even have housing, who are worried about their housing, they represent a whole nother level of that, right? Because those folks represent the folks who work in your fast food restaurants, your service industry, your security industry. These are the folks who take care of the day-to-day needs of building up corporations and of doing service work for rich folks, right? So those folks also fit into the system of you can survive barely, and that's all we need you to do is survive barely. We have no interest in you doing any better than that, because then you can't work at our fast food restaurants anymore, right? You don't need to do that anymore. We need to keep you with just enough so that you keep on coming back to our jobs, and you keep coming back to doing this kind of stuff. And again, you feel so helpless and hopeless that you can't figure out a way, or won't figure out a way to organize, because you are competing against the next person for a job that pays you not enough to survive anyway, right? My answer is always, we need to control every institution and organization that has any control over us. Otherwise, it's not legitimate, right? You cannot have anybody else run the institutions that control your life, your social systems, your economics, your education, right? If that's the case, then you're not free. You're living under somebody else's rule and order.
And I'm glad you broke that down, because I'm tired of the other side, of other people always blaming Black people for their oppression. Like we really just sat there and just made our whole lives negative. And every individual did the same thing that came out of the womb. Like, no, this is by design. Everything is by design. And when you hear about when we were so-called free, or they labeled it and put it in the book that slavery ended, I mean, the unions were created to say, don't hire Black people.
Yeah.
Let's continue to make it difficult for them. And people really don't realize that. That was the start of the illusion of equality.
Yeah. I mean, I think people who claim that the reason we are poor is because we don't do enough for ourselves are buying into a white supremacist ideology, right? And they do so because they are also told that if they have a little bit of resources, it's because they earned it on their own, or it's because they're special somehow, right? And my counter argument is, you can't be special when you live in a society that for every one of you who thinks that they're making it, there's 15 to 20,000 who haven't, right? Any study of any economic system has to show that the economic system has failed when it can't lift up the majority or a critical mass of its poor and working class people to live a sustainable lifestyle. Only in America can you get away with that, right? No one looks at the Soviet Union under communism and suggests for a second that as communism was practiced in the Soviet Union, that it was the people who were lazy and shiftless in Russia and that's why the system of communism doesn't work, right? There's clearly studies, even the media gives you analysis of how communism was bad. But when they look at this system, no one wants to examine the system, right? They want to examine you as individuals. So people are being tricked, right? People are being told that it's their fault because, again, like you said, there's something systematic to it. There's enough people who are benefiting, and then they get to they establish what the propaganda system is that tells you who's a failure and who's a success, right? And you're a success if you look like me, you're a failure if you don't. And you need to struggle to get those material goods, even the fact that they direct our lives to be all about the getting of material goods, right? Which means we're shoppers to them, right? We are people who buy product. They put product out, and our role is to take whatever measly dimes and quarters and nickels we scrape together is to buy their product, right? That's what we're good for. We're good to make it and we're good to buy it. But that's all we're good for, right? So I think those are the kind of things, those are the sort of systematic analysis that if people wanted to make, it's not hard to make, right? But people get so caught up into thinking that they're special that they side with the other side, right? They get so caught up in thinking that they're special, they tell us that all our actions have to be nonviolent. They're so caught up in being special that they want to tell us that we have to talk to white people a certain way. And if we only talk to them a certain way, then we'd be all good, right? They're so special that if they tell us that we have to treat ourselves, and we have to act a certain way in front of the police so that they treat us like human beings, right? As if we walked or talked or did anything differently, that there would be different outcomes, right? Those people have murdered us in the street, and their history is of murdering us in the street because their history is as slave catchers, right? So there's no talking differently or acting differently. There's no sort of dividing us up between people who walk with our pants down and people who walk with suit and ties, and that's why we get treated the way we do, right? That's a complete foolishness of folks who are brought into a system of capitalism and which has destroyed us as a people in terms of where we come from and who we are. And we've been left to rebuild, that system. We rebuild ourselves and our culture and so forth. And we've done it under a system of oppression, right? And people are doing the best that they can, but we need to figure out how to do more and how to get everybody off our backs to allow us to do more.
Exactly. And that brings me to the Peace Center that you all are doing that kind of stemmed out of Be the Change You Want to See. So talk about that, and how did that come about and where you are now with that?
The Peace Center is an idea that was born out of what we talked about earlier, Rashad Brooks, who was killed in a Wendy's in Southwest Atlanta. And after he was killed by the police, there was sort of an uprising in the street, and the Wendy's was burnt down. Local community folks took over the Wendy's, what was left of the Wendy's, and they started putting tents up, they started doing sleepovers, and they started calling for a peace center. It wasn't people like me who are long-term activists and organizers. It was folks from that community, right? And those folks, some folks who were doing that work, they reached out to folks like us to say, how can you help support this? And I saw it as an issue of community control. So the things that we just spoke about Black folks controlling the institutions of their community. We didn't need another Wendy's, and we don't need another Wendy's and or fast food restaurant to replace what was just there, right? We don't need like bad food that's just because it's cheap, but it gives us no nutritional value. We need something else there that solves some issue or does something positive for our community, right? And so they came up with the idea of doing this peace center. So we joined their struggle, to be honest. We joined their struggle to say, let's negotiate with the city, with the corporate owners of Wendy, to see whether or not they are going to turn this land over to the community to do something other than build another fast food restaurant or sell it to some other corporate entity for something else, which the community does not control. The access to the resources, because it's the access to the resources that allow you to build the institutions in the first place. It's the access to the property. It's the access to having some capital to build off of. We need those spaces so that we can plan and organize out of, so that we can save ourselves and not worry about somebody else trying to step in and tell us what's best for us.
Thank you, brother, for being on the show today. It was like you just vomited.
I don't think I've ever heard it put like that.
Right. So thank you again. And I hope you all receive some knowledge from today's show. Food for thought, change your mindset, change your life. So tell the audience where they can find you, how they can get involved, all that good stuff.
Our organization's name is Community Movement Builders. They can find us online at communitymovementbuilders.org. We have all the different social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook, Kamau Franklin. Our needs are like, we need more Black folks involved, and we always need resources. So if you got resources, whether or not you can come volunteer to build something with us, whether you got some resources that you can kick to us, whatever you got some ideas around how we can build better models of economic freedom and alternative models of cooperatives. If you have those ideas, then we need you, we need your support.
Fantastic. And I usually do a tip at the end of the show to give to the audience. It doesn't matter what it is, if it's dealing with homelessness or dealing with what we're talking about right now, the movement, or just something that people can go and apply in their lives, something practical. So I want you to give the tip.
If I was to give a tip for folks about what I consider to be practical, it would be to get involved in what's happening in your community, right? So the tip is that if you're not involved, there are other people that benefit from your non-involvement. You may be tired, you may be stressed, there may be other things going on in your life. I understand all of that. But the tip is that your survival depends on your involvement in your community. So find an organization to get involved in, find your neighborhood association to get involved in, and challenge everybody, right? Challenge us all on what we're thinking and how we're thinking and what brings power to the neighborhood and the community. If folks are talking and they're not trying to bring power to your community, then those folks are wrong off the bat and they need to be re-educated. That's your tip for today.
Well, thank you so much for the tip.
Thank you so much, sister, for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes. So keep doing great things. Let your light continue to shine. You and your team. We're going to keep manifesting all greatness and building us up. So follow Community Movement Builders on all the social media platforms. And you can follow No Address Documentary on Instagram and Facebook. Also visit our website at noaddressdocumentary.com and subscribe to our podcast. Until next time, peace and love.